Devon, are you about to be swallowed by some ooze?
Why do you ask that, Shane?
There's just a giant green field behind you, and I'd like to think that's like your, an enemy ooze entering your area, about to swallow you whole.
Perhaps a scavenging ooze? No, it's actually, I've already gotten covered by ooze. That's what the green is there. We're post ooze.
Doomwake 3, The Secret of the Ooze. So you have a green screen now? Is this a new thing?
Yeah, I think I've had it for like I got it for Christmas, so the last recording I had it too.
So you remember? Well, I wasn't on last week.
Oh, okay.
Was I? Was I? No, I was on, you were not. So 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, we've come to fitting with the newest Magic set, we have solved this case. But you know how I said that I was going to be able to watch a lot more of you stream now that I'm working at home?
Yeah.
I watch even less than of anything.
No.
Because I'm just still getting used to this. I mean, this is very, very fascinating new job stuff. And anyway, I'm glad that you're not actually getting eaten by an ooze.
On the green screen. Course.
On the green screen. I wish that for Riverside FM, get at us, sponsor our podcast. I wish that we could do something with the green screen during recording. I wonder if we can.
Well, if I change my camera source, I can switch the background. Just this camera source, for some reason, this one doesn't let me change the background. But if I do it through my graphics card, I can.
Well, next week, we'll figure this out.
I'll surprise you.
Hello and welcome to episode 258 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike in all formats. My name is Shane here in Denver, Colorado. With me on the line from Massachusetts, it's the one and only Devon O'Donnell, aka Doomwake, who just changed his camera source.
No, I zoomed it out. I zoomed it out to I don't know. Just looks better. But that's me.
I like thinking that you have 8 different cameras that you can just select from. Like you're like an engineer now, just like camera 3.
You were ready for that, huh?
This is an audio medium, so no one saw that, but no. it just zoomed into 1/3 of Devon's face. It was very good.
It was my left cheek, to be precise. I actually have a camera for my left cheek, now that you mention it.
Oh, Devon, this is the first episode. I realized this when we got going. It's the first episode, just me and you, my friend. I'm excited for this.
We're sucking on chili dogs? Is that what's happening?
I was telling Devon, I have, Stan and I have a song, Dave and I have a song, and we have selected Little Ditty about Shane and Devon, 2 Magic players on a podcast.
Maybe we can get some chili dogs when I go to Chicago.
Yeah, you'll definitely want to partake of the Chicago food. Yeah, you're officially in, right? You're officially in for MagicCon.
Booked last week. Got a pretty good deal on a flight. Going to be staying, I think, with Turtle Power. I think he's got an Airbnb with a couple people. So.
Oh man, that's going to be great. Yeah, we are going to have a good time. So one more host added to the fold for MagicCon. So friends out there, you'll see us. We'll have t-shirts that we're wearing, and maybe I'll just have something to hand out. I don't know. We'll find out.
We'll all bring banana costumes.
Yes, that'll be the easiest way to find us. Devon, it wouldn't be a Magic the Gathering podcast without me apologizing for your Cowboys performance this past weekend, by the way.
Yeah, it was a disappointing weekend of hand egg, as the kids say.
Yes, run with the ball.
The good news is the Eagles lost, so I was pretty happy about that.
Man, those Eagles. I mean, I don't even follow football that closely, and I do know that the Eagles, basically the entire second half of the season was cataclysmic, so.
It was bad.
It was pretty bad. So, speaking of things that are not bad, Heavy Play, card gaming accessories brand. You know them from us, hopefully. Improve your gameplay and your game day. Devon grabs his. I have that same one, the same green box that we know and love. Those playmats, those deck boxes, those card sleeves, those dice boxes, enhanced ergonomics, enhanced mobility, enhanced protection. I was actually sleeving up my Amalia Pioneer deck that finally all the cards have arrived. I was sleeving them in the curve inner and outer sleeves so I could have that ready for MagicCon in Chicago this next month. And man, those go together nicely. The EquipMag system, that's the clutch thing. You magnetically attach all of your dice boxes, your deck boxes, your playmat all together, carry it all around in a single hand. It's probably potentially at your LGS, but always at heavyplay.com. If you use the new code, the Dive Down 2024, it's not that hard to remember. You do get 10% off of your first order.
And they are going to be in Chicago. I talked to Randy a couple times, so.
Yeah, they're going to be in Chicago, and they're also going to be in Denver. I will definitely be seeing Randy at it's the DreamHack that's not really a DreamHack here in Denver.
Yeah, I think it's held by Laughing Dragon, I think.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So I'm definitely going to head out to that. So Denverites and anyone coming in, try to find me. Devin, what are we doing on this week's show?
We're talking about Standard. Because we love, Shane, what we love more than anything else in the world is listening to people's opinions when they vote on a poll, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think a mere 13% of our respondents said that they were interested in the Dive Down covering Standard, but here we are planning to talk about Standard. Why are we doing this? Potentially just to frustrate you. Well, it's the RCQ season format, right? So Jan 6th through March 24th. If you want to play in an RCQ, you're going to either be playing Standard or Limited. And we know a lot of our listeners hit up RCQs. People in the Discord are always telling us about how they're doing their RCQ. And from time to time, we hit them up as well. So we thought it made sense. Hey, let's give you an overview about what's going on in Standard to give you all some foundational knowledge on the format and prepare you for playing in your RCQs or any odd Standard event you want to partake in. And Devin, you weren't here last week when Dave and I were chatting, but I'm sure you listened, and I'm sure you know this, even if you didn't. Modern's pretty stable. There's not a lot to talk about here, and there's not really too much focus on Pioneer right now, that the RCs are done. So here we are, we're talking about Standard, which honestly, I'm all about it, because Standard is the most popular format on Arena. We know a lot of people in our audience are playing there. Honestly, I should be playing there on Arena before I fall even further behind in like my collection building. And I know you play a lot of, you play your Standard on Arena, I'm guessing, right, Devin?
Yeah, so I actually made a decision this, at the beginning of January. I kind of wanted to take this month and maybe do a little bit of a push towards Arena content. So I've been playing a lot of Standard and a lot of Timeless. And yeah, just I've accrued a lot of decks. I had a lot of stuff from the previous time that I was testing Standard, which was last January, February for the San Diego RC. So I had a lot of stuff already. And just been playing a ton of Standard and a ton of Timeless on Arena.
And now that we have that nice 3-year rotation, your cards are good for even longer. And so, that's a lot of justification for why we're doing this episode. Hopefully you stick with us. It's going to be a fun one. We're going to go over a lot of different decks. And I think the thing that you will probably realize quickly, audience, is that much like every other format, Standard's got a lot to offer any type of player. So let's get on with this. First, we got some housekeeping. We have a lot of new patrons.
Let's go.
We've got Giuseppe B, Dylan E, Matt B, Ben G, and Dan W. People took my call to action to heart. Thank you, all you new citizens of the Dive Down Nation. Looking forward to interacting with you in the Discord and generally appreciate all your support. We got some new reviews. We've got Chad K on Apple Podcast stating succinctly that Modern is the truth. Sorry, that's not the case this week, Chad.
We'll get you next week, Chad.
Yeah, we definitely will. We've got a lot of Spotify comments. We've got JSN, Jason, 8891, Now with Bacon, Ben J. Dead, DZ, Kimchi, Connor, Master Blaster 87. I'm personally more of a Blaster Master guy myself, but Master Blaster, I'm cool with that too. And DZ also asked what deck to play in Modern,
Rhinos.
Saying that they play Rakdos and Jund colors and other formats. Well, my friend DZ, good thing you have a tier 1 Rakdos deck to also play in Modern as well.
You got Shane and I on the podcast. You know what we're gonna say. So
yeah, we're gonna say don't do anything until turn 3 and you're good to go. Don't worry. You've got Rhinos.
We cast Fire Ice. We cast Dead Dawn. We got plays.
Oh yeah, there's place for days. If you want to be like all of our new patrons, all the new citizens of the nation, go to patreon.com/thedivedown. You help keep us going. You get some swag sent your way. If you cannot do the weekly thing with Patreon, you can go to the store. Go to thedivedown.com/store. Grab yourself some swag there. You can support us via renting online cards on Mana Traders. As I said before, I'm testing out not doing the long-term code with Mana Traders and just seeing if like the cyclical type code is actually better. So you can find that code in the show notes. It is the divedown_3YO. I don't know if that's a 0 or an O. I think it's an O. The divedown_3YO. That's through the end of February. So if you want to use it, check the show notes. Anyway, okay. That's a lot of talking. That's a lot of intro.
A lot of housekeeping.
A lot of housekeeping. Thank you for all that, everybody out there. Let's get into this. Standard for me, standard for you. Let's play standard in a brown canoe. So like I actually started playing Magic with standard. I mean, and I'm not even talking about like the 1995 time when I played Magic the Gathering briefly. Like, I mean, I think that was technically standard, but when I was actually getting back into Magic in the cons era, all I played was standard. I mean, modern was the format for me that was like, whoa, these are how much of those Tarmogoyfs? I mean, it's just kind of, it was to me just seen as something really ambitious.
You know what format I started in was back in Darksteel. So during Affinity, there was a lot of, that's when I played Standard. And for listeners at home that may not know, that was considered to be one of the worst Standard formats of all time. So big surprise that I've been around here for 20 years at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's like starting during Kaladesh or something, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I thankfully got to start in one of the best eras of Standard that people look back on. I mean, the whole, Innistrad, Theros, and then Cons era was, I think, like a really good period of Standard for sure. And we've talked about it on the podcast before.
Yeah, speaking of old Standard, I actually ran a poll, or not ran a poll, but I posted a thing on Twitter about asking people what their favorite Standard format of all time. And that was honestly, the two most common answers were those two, was Innistrad and Cons.
Yeah, I mean, Cons was really good because there were 10 at least decks that were all legitimately viable, and they were all very different from one another, and people could really have their pick of the litter in terms of, hey, I want to play a deck like this, I want to attack the metagame in this particular method. And when I went through the decks in the current Standard format, I saw a lot of similarities to the Con Standard that people really look back fondly on. Because, I mean, decks aside, I think that one of the reasons that people look back on those eras is because Standard was super hype, right? Like it was the format to play. It was a format that people filled their LGS, for weekly events. They had the Pro Tour qualifiers, they had GPs, they had SCG weekends, and Standard was still legitimate and very popular format. And that was the thing, right? Like that was there was a lot of decks, the gameplay was interesting, people had fun playing it, but we all know that Standard has really waned in popularity. And I think we probably all know a lot of the reasons that played into that, right? Like, I think the biggest one, and Devin, I'm curious on your opinion on this one, right? Is like the PT, like the Pro Tour dream, the pro player dream that people had in their mind is basically dead, right? Like the competitive ecosystem that was in place was built around Standard, and people largely built around Standard, and people played it, right? Like people wanted to play the PTQs, they wanted to do the GPs, the SCGs, so they went and they played the format that was expected to be played, which was Standard. And this lifestyle was upended, and no one's making money, unfortunately, or very few people are making money, like writing articles about the latest changes to Standard metagames and sideboard guides and things like that.
Yeah, and another big part of that was also, like you mentioned, the events, because there was all these Grand Prix so you had the Grand Prix circuit, which was Grand Prix feeding into Pro Tours. The Grand Prix not only qualified you for the Pro Tour, but they also had their own large, payout or whatever. So you were playing for money and for PT invites. You had the Pro Points when those were still around. Those were very, very important. So these Grand Prix were just huge events that people everybody wanted to go to for whatever reason. And then, like you mentioned, you used to be able to get to those pro levels like gold, platinum, silver. I remember those levels as well. And now since they've removed that, they basically removed competitive Magic as a full-time job. Obviously there's other means and stuff, but yeah, that's pretty much it. And it almost feels like Standard has maybe become much more of a casual format because of that.
Yeah, I forget exactly who said this. It might have been Mengucci, but I don't want to pin it on him because it's kind of a negative comment. But this person said, Forsyth asked, I believe in late 2022, maybe, like there was like that big thing where they asked people like, hey, what happened to Standard? Like, why did you stop playing Standard? And they were basically like, hey, you killed this system that was basically ran around Standard, and people started playing other formats that they realized were better. Right. And I think there's some fairness to that, but I also think that, formats like Pioneer, formats like Modern have strengths and weaknesses. They have lulls and they have peaks and valleys and all those adjectives. No, those are nouns.
Words.
All those words. But I think like one of the strengths and weaknesses of Standard, and perhaps one of the factors that made it less popular, is its dynamic nature. It's changing more often. New sets make more cards come into the format and these new strategies. And so you have to keep up with it a little bit more aggressively than you do the other formats. Like, say what you will about Modern and Pioneer, like Standard requires a significant investment of time and potentially cash to keep up with. And sometimes people want the stability, or they want to be able to say, okay, I've got Greasefang from 8 months ago. Oh, okay, I got to get 7 new cards or something like that, and I'm good to go, right? They don't have to be like, all of these creatures are out of the format now.
And some of those are even uncommons too, So it's right. And another good example is like, I think I bought into Rhinos, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And since I purchased the deck, it's always been a tier 1 deck. It's like, it's never been a bad deck. So
yeah, I remember like when I was playing Standard, competitively, I guess I would say, like I did do like PPTQs and was at, the weekly events all the time, is I remember doing a lot of buying and selling and changing and buying new sideboard cards because of I played a Teamer and then Gruul Monsters in cons. And Kibler was writing like a weekly article on SCG about his testing and deck lists and cards that he was doing on like SCG. And so I would kind of like follow that and be making changes or buying like whole new decks because of myself. I'm like, well, I'm going to buy Abzan Midrange now or something like that, right? And I remember doing a lot more buy listing to the store and picking cards up like much more than I do even nowadays. So, and then all that investing is kind of sketchy, right? Like WOTC is printing cards into Modern directly now. Fewer Standard cards are making an impact in these longer term formats. Some of the cards that are expensive in Standard are not expensive elsewhere. I mean, they're not useful elsewhere. So like you had to be concerned about like your timing into like entering and exiting Standard purchases. Like, oh, rotation's coming up. Am I going to hold on to this, or am I going to like sell it?
Yeah, I was looking at prices the other day. This is maybe an extreme example, but I was looking up Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, and that card I was looking at it one day. It was like, I think 15 or $16. I was like, you know what, that's too expensive. And 2 days later, it was already up to $30. And it's like, that's a card that you're literally not going to play in any other format. It's only good. It's only expensive because it's a mythic and a set that wasn't open that much in Standard. So yeah, there may be more extreme example, but yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah. Now that we're in the RCQ format, I have a feeling that some of these Standard pieces are going to become more expensive as people are prepping to play these paper events. So what I think's funny too is like, I think Pioneer kind of proved to be more stable than people might have expected. And I think it's actually allowed for fewer Standard power level cards to really enter the format than I expected, for sure. Like, because, when you look at Modern, you're like, well, okay, that's a big bar to clear. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, okay, well, Pioneer, maybe this gives us opportunity for like these Standard concepts to, enter the format. And then I think that we have seen the power level of Pioneer is surprisingly high, and potentially not allowing for that as much as maybe even WOTC hoped, right?
Right. And yeah, like, you see maybe every set, 1 or 2 cards get into modern, maybe 3, 4, or 5, maybe an uncommon or 2 get into Pioneer. But for the most part, yeah, it's like even the new sets for Pioneer don't add a ton to those formats. Another kind of big part of this, another thing that we want to consider here is fire design, right? There was maybe about 3 to 4 years so fire design, for those wondering at home, I think it technically started in War of the Spark, but Kaladesh was really the first set that I can remember where they were basically just having to ban stuff almost every release, right? It was like you had Felidar Guardian, Emrakul, like that era of stuff, all the energy stuff, and then you had like the Theros with Once Upon a Time, Oko, that kind of stuff, Ikoria. It was an absolute mess for about 3 to 4 years, right around until Kaldheim. And yeah, just like that really made people lose confidence in the design team, and I really think that over the past couple of years since Kaldheim, we've kind of started to see a little bit of a different design philosophy. And I do think that just sets are designed a little bit better now, but yeah, that period of time was rough.
Yeah, for sure. And then, we had Arena get created. Arena is primarily like a draft and standard play environment, and that probably ate into people's desire to play paper standard. Like, why do I have to deal with all these paper cards? Why do I have to go to the LGS to play like 4 rounds over 3.5 hours when I could just jam games all day in my PJs? You know,
the mismatched flannels.
Yeah, except my mismatched flannels. Perfect. This is how I want to live. And what I think's good though, after all this negative stuff, is WOTC was realizing all this, of course, and they started asking some questions to the community in late 22, that Aaron Forsyth sort of Twitter thread that I mentioned. And then in 2023, they started making changes to standard, especially like standard rotation, to try to ensure that people felt more comfortable to buy into the format. So the time that cards would exist in the format would be no longer 2 years, but now 3 years. And so that's a big difference. And then the creation of like RCQ seasons meant that they could effectively force people, like they're kind of forcing us, to look at standard more seriously if they wanted to qualify for the RCEs to make it to the Pro Tour. And like standard never died. People just changed how they engaged with it. And then the death of the Pro Tour lifestyle, we've got COVID impacting store play, we've got the creation of Arena, we've got the sort of expanse of the popularity of Modern and Pioneer. But this engagement, I think, is what WOTC wants to change, our engagement with Standard. And I think what they want top-tier competitive play to look like does include Standard. And so here we are. We're talking about it. And I'm more than happy about it because, I played Standard this week. I did a lot of looking at all these decks, and I'm pretty hyped to talk to Devon about them because you've been playing quite a bit. And I think the deck diversity and I think the options that people have to engage with the game is pretty cool right now. So, you probably know this, but we're going to talk, what is Standard?
Technicalities.
It's the oldest 60 card constructed format. It's got the smallest number of legal cards. Like you basically have like 9 to 12 sets. You make a deck from the cards in those sets and you play some matches, right? So currently it starts with Innistrad Midnight Hunt and goes through Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And then, new sets come out. Those are going to be legal as well. And then in fall of this year, Innistrad Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow, Neon Dynasty, and Streets of New Capenna are all going to rotate out. And then future rotations happen every fall. So yeah. What I think's cool though is like, okay, Standard's small, right? Like that, does that mean I don't have as many cool decks to play? But it's got all the archetypes. Like they didn't get created when Modern happened, right? Like we've got aggressive decks, we've got mid-range decks, we've got control, we've got combo, we've got ramp, whatever you want to play. There's going to be some example of that deck. But I think unlike the larger formats, is that the relative power of those archetypes might differ more greatly depending on the environment. Like sometimes aggro is S tier, right? Like sometimes control is just okay. Sometimes it's one of the best decks in the format. Because the card pool's smaller and the metagame's more dynamic, that's one of the things that I think people have to think about more often than they do in perhaps the other formats.
Yeah, I think Standard is like when you kind of compare it to Modern and Pioneer in terms of an average week-to-week metagame, the number of decks that people play at any given event is probably smaller than the number of decks that people play in Modern or Pioneer, but that's just because the card pool is smaller. But the other thing you have to think about is it's way more important in Standard to have those like be up a leg on the metagame, right? In Modern, you can like take your Team Aranos deck and change one or two sideboard cards and like, okay, that's fine. But in Standard, if one deck is like, let's say, Golgari Midrange is bad for a certain week, you can't just change one or two sideboard cards, because if you have a bad matchup against a deck that's 20 to 30% of the field, then you're just dead on arrival at that point. So you really do have to change the entire archetype week to week as opposed to just fixing up the sideboard slots.
Yeah, that's one of the things like I remember when I was getting into Magic is, famously people like Brad Nelson were considered like standard metagame masters, right? Like they just knew the deck to bring, they knew the tweaks to make, they knew like the creature suite to be running and removal suite and things like that, right? And I think that's the type of environment where you can get more percentage points than you can with like, hey, one or two sideboard changes to your Modern deck, like you were saying, right? And I think that's an important point I didn't think about until right now, Devin, is kind of like in Modern, I feel like maybe 56 to 60 of your main deck cards are almost kind of like outlined for you. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, hey, this deck is so tuned and so on rails that all of my gameplay is going to happen from the sideboard. And that's definitely not the case for Standard, right? Because like the relative power level of many creatures might be pretty even, but they might have really big utility in particular matchups, right? So you can be like, okay, this entire card is out and I'm going to bring in something else entirely. And so like you can have a pretty big flux in what is considered like an archetype, like, Golgari Midrange, but you're like, oh yeah, I don't even run Gix anymore. Like I run like this other card entirely, right? And it's just based off of its relative power level compared to other stuff. And that doesn't really happen, I think, as frequently in formats like Pioneer and Modern, because your strategy is more on rails. It's kind of like, hey, this is defined, this is what this deck is doing, and I'm not going to mess with that game one. I'm going to tune it after the fact.
Yeah, to that point, it almost feels like the decks in Pioneer and Modern are maybe, I don't know if this is a good way to describe it, but sort of not one-dimensional, but they know, like you mentioned, they know what their plan is doing. And the decks in Standard are, like we talked about before, the dynamicness, or if that's actually a word. But yeah, the decks in Standard are much more dynamic, and they can basically play two different roles, right? Like there's the blue-black decks that some of them play more cheap creatures, but those cheap creatures also are good in the mid game and good in the late game and stuff like that. So these cards, because and that's just kind of like more of a design thing, because the way that they print cards, they're just good at every stage of the game. So, the decks are much more capable of playing different sorts of games, and they're not one dimensional.
Yeah, and I think that's a strength of Standard, because the concept of mid-range until somewhat recently, even in something like Modern, was almost laughable, because it's just kind of like, hey, I'm going to execute my game plan and you try to stop me type thing, right? And I think that's rarely the case in Standard, and it's typically more interactive, it's typically more back and forth, and it's typically an environment that allows you to think about your entire 75 in like a very sort of cohesive and cross-sectional way. That's a very fancy way of me saying, it's not as outlined as perhaps it might be in other formats. Okay, getting to the point of what we're talking about this week. What's Standard looking like right now as we enter the RCQ season? So I turned to our data guru, Frank Karsten, author of the metagame.
We love Frank.
Oh man, Frank. Thank you, Frank, for being here for us. He recently published an overview of the Standard metagame in the Metagame Mentor articles. He was helping people prep for the new RCQ season, so please allow me to aggressively crib from his work. And he uses a point system that he developed to create kind of a winner's metagame share based off of the deck performances and Magic Online events. So he kind of has the overall metagame share, and then based on their performance, like how well they're doing kind of overall. And let's start from the top. Most popular deck and best performing deck. So 18% of the overall meta right now, 27% of the winner's metagame right now. That makes it sound scary, but I think what we're going to talk about, I feel like this is a pretty attackable deck. This is domain ramp, and this is the deck to beat in standard right now, but right now means like the last few weeks. Doesn't mean the last 6 months. And so what domain ramp is doing is it uses, cards like Topiary Stomper, Invasion of Zendikar, all like these 3-mana ramp cards to eventually ramp into Atraxa Grand Unifier or a kicked Archangel of Wrath. So it has a bunch of triomes, to support Leyline Binding. It has the 7-mana card Herd Migration, which creates a 3/3 beast token for each basic land type you control. So yes, you can basically put 15 power on the board for 7 mana. My opponent did it to me this week, and I conceded quickly after.
It's like expensive rhinoes.
That's a very good point. It's expensive rhinos, but when you're ramping to it, it's not that bad. Herd Migration can also be cast for 1 and a green to search up a basic land card and gain you 3 life. So it's a perfect type of ramp card. The speed bump and ramp, well, not ramp, and mana consistency. It's got Beanstalk for late game power, but you get the idea. It's got a lot of tapped lands. It's got a high average mana value, so it's pretty slow. So this is where like aggressive decks can get under it. And, but then it's got sweepers, 5-mana sweepers, Sunfall, Depopulate. And so that's kind of its general idea is I'm going to ramp and I'm going to do something so big you can't go over the top.
Right. So, well, the thing is there's not really going over the top because Atraxa is really just the best top end.
Yeah, that's the top.
The one thing I will say, so I put this note here saying there's no way going over the top of it. There is one deck that we might get to a little bit later that does maybe have you have to go really deep if you want to go over the top of this deck. But the big point is, the best way to attack this deck is to go under it. Right,
yes.
Because like Shane said, the deck has a lot of enter the battlefield tap lands. It's very expensive. It's got a lot of clunky cards. Even something like Topiary Stomper, it can't block until turn 5 or turn 6. So if you can apply a lot of pressure early, that can be very good and maybe like be able to close out the game with a haste creature after a Wrath. And then the other big way to attack it is with the Esper decks. The reason that they are good against domain is because they have the cheap pressure plus the disruption. So they have a good mix of both, but yeah, there's really no all of the mid-range decks, Golgari, Rakdos Midrange, all of this stuff just get completely annihilated by the top end.
Do you think that a big reason that this deck is surging recently is because of Cavern of Souls? I think formerly you could play a counter magic deck against this, right? You cast your big angel and what's the one that does 4 mana or more? It's from Khans.
Disdainful Stroke?
Yes, Disdainful Stroke, right? You could formally Disdainful Stroke this stuff, but Cavern naming angels gets Atraxa and Archangel of Wrath to be uncounterable. So the counter strategy got worse. What do you think is making this deck so popular and well performing right now?
I don't necessarily think it's directly related to Cavern of Souls. I just think that there are a lot more people that have been picking up non-blue mid-range decks like Rakdos Midrange, Golgari Midrange, and those are basically the exact decks that Domain preys on. So as those decks pick up in popularity, people are putting Trumpeting Carnosaur in their Rakdos decks. I've seen that happen a little bit. So they're kind of increasing their curve to be able to keep up with Esper. And when you have a mid-range deck that's increasing its curve, that recipe is just never, ever going to line up against the domain deck. So I think that's part of it too.
Okay. Yeah. So we're just seeing the natural evolution of a smaller metagame, right? We're just we're going to respond to it by playing these domain decks. There are a lot of mid-range decks in this format. And so I think the next one to talk about after that is Esper Midrange, which is the former top dog of standard. You might have heard Esper Midrange be talked about even just in sort of casual observation of competitive Magic. The finals of World Championship 29 was an Esper Midrange mirror. It's at 13.7 of the meta right now, 12% of the winner's meta. It's a pretty big difference from the domain deck. This is an Esper Midrange pile. It's got a really high card quality. It's got things like Wedding Announcement. It's got the Schooner. It has Rafine, Scheming Seer. It's got Sheoldred, the Apocalypse. And, it's got a bunch of removal. It's got efficiently costed threats. It has card advantage. It can close the door. It's got all the usual mid-range stuff.
So, yeah, I've actually seen some more recent versions of Esper I think particularly in the hands of Yeoman5, who's been kind of doing very, very well in the Moto challenges over the past couple of weekends, they're kind of lowering their curve a little bit. So traditional Esper decks, you might think of like the powerful 3 and 4 drops like Shieldred, Gix, Rafine, Wedding Announcement, all that stuff. But they're actually going quite a bit lower to the ground and playing Spyglass Siren, Fairy Dream Thief, Subterranean Schooner, Deep Cavern Bat, Fairy Mastermind. And I think the reason for that is, as we talked about, again, with Domain, you kind of need to apply some amount of early pressure, because if you just have a pile of disruption and you're not forcing the Domain deck to do anything, they can eventually just kind of get everything set up, find the Cavern, find the Atraxa. So you need that early pressure to be able to make them act in a way that they don't want to act. And that's kind of where the Schooner package comes in. Also, one other thing worth noting is Subterranean Schooner is completely insane against people that are playing 4 Go for the Throat, because a lot of the Rakdos and Golgari decks are going more on Go for the Throat and less on like Bitter Triumph cut down to help against mono red, because you don't want Bitter Triumph paying 3 life against mono red. But as more people put Go for the Throat and cut down in their deck, those cards look pretty embarrassing against Subterranean Schooner.
Because it's an artifact.
Yep.
Yeah, makes total sense.
Can't kill it.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some other mid-range decks, and then I kind of want to talk about why there are so many different mid-range decks and kind of what your thought process is on when you would pick one or the other, besides just, I like these colors type thing. So we've got Rakdos Discover, which is 8.9% of the meta and 7.7% of Frank's Winners meta. So we've got another mid-range deck. This one runs red, and like Bloodbraid Elf of olden days, this one uses the Discover Cascade-ish mechanic just for sheer value, right? Like Geological Appraiser, Trumpeting Countersaur, they live strongly on in this deck if you were briefly enjoying it in Pioneer Constructed. And, you know, the usual suite of like efficient and annoying creatures. We've got Shieldred, of course. There's Cruelty of Gix, a 5-mana saga, which can like reanimate an earlier Carnosaur that you cast as a removal spell. Also triggers the Discover effect when it enters the battlefield. You can live the dream. Discover into Appraiser, and then discover into Preacher of the Schism. Like, I dare you to do it. You know you want to do it. What are your thoughts on this?
Rakdos is dope. I think Rakdos is pretty good. One thing that I kind of wanted to bring up, I didn't put this in the notes, but I'm gonna freestyle here a little bit. So I saw a tweet from Dom Harvey, friend of the show, Dom Harvey, the other day, and he made a tweet. He said, "Geological Appraiser in Standard Black Red is a great example of weird information cascades from people just copy pasting last week's list." In his words, quote unquote, he says the card is awful. You already have too many good cards all up the curve. Just play those. See, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. When I played this deck, I was a pretty big fan of Appraiser. I kind of understand where he's coming from, where like you don't want the kind of the roulette aspect of, you know, you remember how with like Bloodbraid Elf, when you were playing with Jund before and you like didn't want to cast Bloodbraid Elf on an empty board because you could hit like a fatal push or something like that. Exactly. And it's kind of the same thing with Appraiser. Like if your opponent has an empty board, it's kind of awkward to cast because you have so many 2-mana removal spells. But the one thing that I will say is that card is unbelievable in the kind of mid-range mirror, like if you're playing against an opposing Esper deck or something like that. So just like a quick note on Appraiser. As far as Rakdos as a whole, I don't really think that we've found a consensus best version of Rakdos yet.
Yeah, because like I remember in Frank's article, he was saying like there was sort of a reanimator sort of mid-range strategy in Rakdos, things like that.
Yeah, there's kind of sort of, I guess, 3, maybe 3.5 versions of Rakdos, but there's the one that's kind of super low to the ground that stops the curve at Appraiser. Then there's one that like kind of goes slightly bigger where it's playing Appraiser and Trumpeting Carnosaur. Mm-hmm. And then there's one that just goes as big as you can possibly go. Like you need to be 10 feet to ride this ride or some kind of thing, where it's playing like 4 copies of Breach the Multiverse, 4 copies of Atali, a big scores to ramp into those. We can talk about that later. But as far as Rakdos is concerned, like this Rakdos Discover deck, I kind of like it, but I think I would, again, as we talked about previously, I think I'd prefer to be lower to the ground. So I think I would like to be a version that doesn't have Carnosaur and kind of more aggressive with like maybe Inties, Gixes, 1-drops, that kind of stuff.
Love it. Next up, our third mid-range deck in a row, if you can believe that. We've got Golgari Midrange. Do you want to play Liliana of the Veil again?
Yes.
Do you like drawing cards and losing life?
Heck yeah.
Do you live in a swamp?
Undecided.
Well, here you go, Shrek. Here's your deck. We've got...
Just call me Shrek.
Well, I mean, you don't live in the swamp, but our listeners out there, if they live in swamps, there you go. So, I mean, much like Esper, much like Rakdos, this is a value deck, but in black-green. It's got removal. It's got high toughness creatures. It's got hand disruption. It's got a strong creature land in Restless Cottage. And this can take you back to the olden days of Modern when Golgari Midrange was a deck that you could conceivably play.
Well, if your name is Electric Bob, then you can still play Golgari Midrange in Modern. But shout out to Electric Bob. This is... So,
Soul
Shane,
Maka.
this is... Yeah, the rocket is millions. This is the deck that I have played by far the most out of all of these decks. I checked my MTG Untap stats, and I think I was 26-6 with it. So I've been winning a lot and not losing a lot with this deck. It is my number one choice for when I get out to an RCQ, which I hope I get to do soon, but it's for sometime in the near future. Yeah, I think this deck is busted. It's kind of, so the reason I think it's so good and kind of better than the other mid-range decks is it has all of the tools that you would want in a mid-range mirror. So we kind of talk about all these mid-range decks. You notice they're all playing black, right? Because black is the best mid-range color. But what are the supporting casts, right? So you have Esper that has Rafine. It's good, but it does die to removal. You have Red, which has Appraiser, a little bit better because it has Appraiser and help these 2-for-1s. But then you get to Golgari. And you have what I think is maybe the most important mid-range card in the entire format, which is Mosswood Dread Knight. So that card is so good because it is just incredibly flexible, right? If you're playing against a deck you need to race, you just have a 2-mana 3/2, and that's totally fine and acceptable. If you have a bunch of stuff going on your hand, you can play it. If they kill it, okay, who cares? You just cast it again next turn. So it's really good at grinding. It's really good at pressuring. It's insane at trading. Like it basically just stonewalls Gix by itself because nobody wants to attack a Gix into that thing. It'll just block and cast it again next turn. So I think that card is just so phenomenally good in the mid-range mirrors to the point where people have actually started main decking Anoint with Affliction just to deal with the Mosswood Dread Knight.
And what does that card do?
It's a 2-mana removal spell. It says exile a creature that has mana value 3 or less.
Okay.
So it doesn't hit a lot, but it exiles, which is important against Dread Knight.
Okay. So it's all about the Dread Knight. What about is Restless Cottage worth going out of your way for, do you think? Or do you think all the creature lands are pretty even?
I think all the creature lands are kind of the same to me. I mean, Cottage is fine. It's 4 mana, make a 4/4. When it attacks you, exile a card from a graveyard and get a food. It's fine, but I guess if I had to pick the best of the creature lands across the mid-range deck, blue-white is probably the best one.
Yeah, the flyer.
The Anchorage, yeah. The flyer is probably the best one.
The gigantic flying island thing.
Yeah, no, that one's good.
It's like a 2/2.
The other really nice thing about Golgari is you get Sentinel, the Nameless City. And the reason that card is good is 4 toughness. There's a lot of 3/3s and 3/2s, like Geological, Gix, all that kind of stuff, opposing Dread Knights. So.
Yeah. The toughness here, I think, is clutch for against the aggressive red deck.
Yep, that too.
You just get the toughness here that I think, like you said, can either be blocking or be trading or things like that. So,
and then one last note on Golgari, a very, very important, another 3-drop, of course, is Glissa. So, the domain matchup is not good. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's probably your worst matchup for Golgari. But the games you win typically do involve Glissa because Glissa, when it attacks, can blow up an enchantment. So, if they binding something and you hit them with Glissa, you can just blow up their binding and get your thing back.
Okay. I like it. Okay, so if you think Golgari is the best, and I think we can see why people would probably want to play Rakdos, maybe just for the fun Discover nature. What's the deal with Esper? When would someone choose Esper over Golgari if we're comparing those two decks?
So of the 3 mid-range decks, Esper has the best chance against Domain because it has blue for counterspells.
Okay.
So that's the reason you would play Esper. So I think it's Esper is probably better than Rakdos in the mid-range fights, in the mid-range heads-ups, but it's definitely better against Domain. And then Golgari is probably the best against mid-range, but the worst against Domain.
Okay, this makes sense. Any concept of a Sultai deck out of the Golgari, or does the mana not support it?
Well, Shane, it's funny you asked that because I've been thinking about that. I've been kind of labbing ways on how to beat the Domain deck with Golgari. The 2 things that I came up with was either splashing blue for counter spells and just praying to God the mana works, or playing
that always works really well historically in Magic.
or just sideboarding a bunch of Breach the Multiverses to hit their Atraxas.
And is Breach is it 7 mana? Is it 5 mana? What's the
7.
Breach one? Was that the one I was asking you about? Like, when do you bring this in? And like
Yes.
Stanislav jokingly goes, for the grindy matchups.
He's not wrong, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, anything that's that high mana value's got to be, right?
7 mana, each player mills 10, and then you reanimate something from both players' graveyards.
Okay, I can do that.
So
Sounds
you can
good.
like get your Shieldred and their Atraxa, and then it's just like,
So it's a win con.
Yeah.
All right, mid-range piles. And now we're into the good stuff. We're into the aggressive decks. So, it's below the ramp deck, it's below the mid-range deck in terms of the winner's metagame share. This still can clearly contend in Azorius Soldiers, which is 6.6% of the metagame, but 7.7% of the winner's metagame, which, if you were listening closely before, is kind of right about where Golgari Mid and Rakdos Discover decks currently are as well. So we could effectively say, based on Frank's recent analysis, Azorius Soldiers is up there. So it's called soldiers, but it's kind of a misnomer at this point, like, because the number of actual soldiers in the deck seems like it's actually dropped over time. Like, this is Azorius Flash. Like, there's a lot of opportunities to have fun and be tricky here. Like, you can represent spells, you can represent instants, you can represent creatures. Like, you can really play around your opponent or make them think you have something you don't, and that can cause a lot of consternation, I think, especially for inexperienced opponents. Like, if I was facing down Azorius Flash, if I didn't have like deck list up in front of me, like, I'd just be like, whatever. Like, I'm just going to go and see what you got. Like, you've got Zephyr Sentinel, you've got Make Disappear, you've got Resolute Reinforcements, you've got Werefox Bodyguard, you've got Tishana's Tidebinder. These are all cards at your disposal in this deck. And we've got cards like Knight Errant of Eos. You've probably heard us mention that for like Pioneer, Boros Prowess. You've got Virtue of Loyalty. These cards give you some staying power, some inevitability. But I called this an aggressive deck. But Devon, when I'm looking at the list, it doesn't seem like hyper aggressive to me.
Right. And it's definitely not as much as you mentioned, like it has been in previous versions. The most popular approach to kind of the blue-white, I guess we'll call it like, I don't want to call it mid-range because we just had a bunch of mid-range decks, but like aggressively slanted mid-range. Really the only soldier payoff left here. And remember, these versions you previously played, what's the name of the other lord? It's Valiant Veteran, I think. It was like 2 mana 2/2, gives all your stuff +1/+1, and then you can exile from your graveyard to put a counter on all your creatures. We no longer have that card. The only soldier payoff we have really is Harbin Vanguard Aviator, which is a really good payoff, not gonna lie. That card's very good. It's blue and white for a 3/2 flyer, and whenever whenever you attack with 5 or more soldiers, all of your stuff gains flying until end of turn.
That's a lot of soldiers.
Yeah, but like you have Resolute Reinforcements that makes a body, you have a bunch of 1-drops, Zephyr Sentinel. But yeah, it really kind of does play out like a flash deck where you are kind of maybe pressuring them a little bit early with the 1-drop, the card that I can never remember, the one that you look at cards, the one I'm talking, this.
Yeah, 3-Minute Inspector, I love him.
No, the one that you pay 4, look at the top 4 cards, get a soldier. What?
The Siren? No, go ahead.
We'll get it later. But that card, that's you. Basically, you want to apply pressure with that stuff, and kind of use your counter spells to back those up. There is a different version of Azorius, which basically takes all of the small creatures out of the deck, and just the only sorcery speed stuff, the only sorcery speed card in the entire deck basically is Wedding Announcement, and then it's even more flash stuff. Wandering Emperors, more counter spells, Fairy Mastermind, max Virtue of Loyalties. So I think that might be the version of Azorius that I kind of prefer a little bit more, because I think when you start to add more of the small stuff to your deck, you end up a little bit worse off in the mid-range fights because your cards trading for cut down. Like, you don't want to play even a 1-mana card that trades with cut down. You kind of need all your stuff to get value. And that's where the flash version kind of excels to me, is in those mid-range decks. But yeah, blue-white, a couple of different ways to build it, but yeah, definitely a good deck.
When are you picking this deck? Right? Like, we're talking about some mid-range piles. We kind of talked about when you might choose Golgari, when you might choose Esper. When are you looking at, like, Azorius Soldiers, Azorius Flash seems like it's hanging with those other decks, but I'm curious, what do you think is giving it that power?
So I think, as we talked about Domain, one of the best ways to beat Domain is go under it.
Yeah.
And I think the soldier-focused version that plays the 1-drops, that plays Zephyr Sentinel and Harbin, that deck can not only go under it, but also have the counter spells that you need to. So I think that has, like, that might be one of Domain's worst matchups because, again, it has the early pressure, but then you have the counter spells to be able to fight over the Wraths.
Okay, that makes total sense. So now we're talking with this next deck. We've got mono red aggro, 7.7% of the meta, 6.1% of the winner's meta. Mono red in standard, name a more perfect duo. The evergreen statement, mono red. I guess it could be ever red statement. You got your haste creature. You got a lot of haste creatures in this deck. So much haste, and
all of them.
That's really what made the deck for me when I play tested it this weekend. Was like, it's almost like you can win out of nowhere very often, and frequently in past formats when I played mono red is rebuilding from a wrath took some time. And you can rebuild from a wrath really quickly with this mono red deck. You've got the creatures, you've got the burn spells, you've got Monastery Swift Spear back, so let's go. I mean, this does what you expect, which is attack, burn, even runs like cards like Witchstalker Frenzy, which can take out a Sheoldred that's trying to stabilize, which is quite nice. I think in a world that's currently dominated by Domain Ramp, I think this is probably the most direct counter, and of course, one that I'm fine having exist again in the format. But what do you think about red right now, Devin? We see it's clearly a little bit below these other decks in terms of winning.
Right. Now, I will preface this by saying I do think that mono red is quite good against Domain. Like, if you are expecting upwards of 30 to 35% of your tournament being Domain, you could do worse than this deck, right? Mm-hmm. The one issue that I have with mono red is I think it just has a really abysmal mid-range matchup, because the mid-range decks are getting so much better at being able to, like, they're lowering their curve, they're adding more cut downs, they're playing more 2-drops, more 3-drops, and as the mid-range decks lower their curve, and it's kind of like this weird, we talked about the cyclical nature of standard before. So you have Domain, and you have, if Domain becomes very, very good, what are the best ways to attack Domain? Lower your curve, play more cheap cards, right? Now, if you have a mid-range deck that's like already probably okay against mono red, if they're even lowering their curve to be able to beat Domain, then where are you? What else are you beating besides the Domain deck at that point? And that's kind of where I think mono red sits. So at this current time, at the time of recording, I would not recommend choosing mono red for the RCQ. But who knows? Maybe a week or two from now, things go back to the way they were before, where people are playing less Domain, mid-range decks increase their curve again, and that might be a good time to pounce. And basically with mono red, you have to pick the perfect weekend to play it. And as of right now, I don't think it's the right time.
Yeah, like I think there are ways to make mono red better against those mid-range decks, but then I think you're probably diluting the core strategy that you need to win, right? Like if you're bringing in removal spells to try to like chip in with your creatures, I think you're going to have a harder time than if those creatures were just hitting in the first place and you were like lightning striking your opponent or something like that. So I think like you're in a tough spot. I see what you're saying. Like I had some pretty cozy matchups against like Domain, against like it was pretty Azorius Control-y type feeling. Like it was kind of a bigger Azorius deck that I played, and I think I won both of those 2-1, but if the opponent starts stabilizing, you're in a really tough spot, like any aggressive deck like this. And I think, like you're saying, is these mid-range decks can stabilize much more quickly than the slower Domain deck and any type of control strategy that someone's trying to employ on you. So
one thing that I did see over the weekend, I think it was Zen Takahashi tweeted that they won an RCQ over the weekend with mono red, and their particular version had 4 main deck Urabrask's Forge. It's a card that's very commonly sideboarded in mono red, but I actually kind of like that approach a little bit, where you are going just a little bit bigger. You're not going super big, like playing a bunch of 4-drops and all that stuff to the point where you're diluting your deck, but you're going just big enough to have that one haymaker in the mid-range matchups, because a lot of these mid-range decks don't have a way to remove that card from the battlefield, especially in a game 1 situation.
Yeah, I mean, we saw something similar happen, and I don't think for the same reasons at all, but do you remember like the days of Big Red in Pioneer? Where it's just like, hey, we're going to keep making this deck bigger, and we're going to
How big can we make it?
Yeah, exactly. Like, can we be casting like 5 mana? Can we be casting like Stormbreath Dragons effectively in my aggressive red deck? And I think like that's again one of the options you have in this type of environment, right? Where it's like, hey, if I'm going against more low to the ground mid-range decks, what do I need to have in my board and potentially main deck, because there are flex spots here, that's going to get me the edge? Like, am I going to be casting, flying hasters? Or am I going to be casting, cards that kind of can avoid their removal or pass their power and toughness test and things like that? And I think like those are the options that do exist in the format. I don't think the deck probably plays as well as it wants to on the aggressive end, meaning like I think it's a better aggressive deck than big red deck. I wasn't really impressed with the higher mana value cards that were in the list I played at all. Like I cast one once, I think it was like a 4 mana 3/3, had haste, and when it attacked, it put like a 1/1 counter on something else, which
Raiju.
I'm sorry?
Thundering Raiju.
That sounds right? And for a 4 mana 3/3 haster, even with the small sort of like counter synergy thing, like I assumed this thing flew. So
no, it does not.
No, it doesn't fly, man. I turned it sideways into my opponent's creatures, and we were chit chatting because it was pretty casual, and we were just having some fun. We were both like new at standard, and my opponent was like, "Yeah, I had to check that twice too," because he was like, "Why is he attacking with this?"
If you look at the art, it does kind of look like it would have flying.
Yes, it looks kind of like a dragon to me. I looked more closely, and I was like, "Okay, I see what they're doing here. They're pulling one over on Shane." So yeah, even a 4 mana 3/3 haster doesn't get flying these days. We're not in Fire Design any longer.
That's like Hidden Reach, but the reverse of Hidden Reach.
It's definitely what's the card that everyone always forgets has reach, or forgot that they had reach? Man, what was it?
Questing Beast, right?
Yes, probably, because it has like 8 different other lines of text. I hate to bring us back to this, Devon. Other mid-range decks. We've got people playing Dimir. We've got people playing Orzhov. We've got people playing other types of Rakdos mid. I was going to skip over these entirely. You valiantly wrote a little bit about each one of them. So what are your thoughts on the style of decks?
Well, before we get to that, do you want to do Azorius Tokens, or do you want to skip that one?
Oh, yeah, let's do Azorius Tokens. You're right, because I did skip that. We'll just rewind a little bit. Azorius Tokens, 2.9% of the meta, 3.7% of the winner's meta. This looks like your kind of deck, Devon. What is going on here? I'm going to let you run with this one.
All right. So what this deck is trying to do, it's really centered around the card Invasion of Segovia. So that card is 2 and a blue. Makes 2 1/1 tokens, and I believe its defense, it's a battle, and I believe its defense is 4, and the backside is a 3/3 that says non-creature spells you control have Convoke, and at the beginning of your end step, you can untap 4 creatures. So what you are doing, you're laughing. What's funny?
Oh, it's sick. I forgot. I knew that made the non-creature spells have Convoke. I didn't know it also untapped them.
Oh, it does everything. Yeah, that card is broken. So what you're kind of trying to do is you have some early token-y type stuff, like you have Warden of the Inner Sky, you have Spyglass Siren, so those cards kind of work well together because Spy makes 2 things for Warden, and then your 2 drops are like Regal Bunnicorn, Subterranean Schooner, and the Virtue of Loyalty. So you're curving that stuff. Like the best curve, this is kind of the dream, we all talk about the dream scenario. Spyglass Siren into Schooner into Segovia. You use a token to crew the Schooner, 4 power, flip the Segovia, end step, untap 4 dudes. You have 4 creatures untapped to cast whatever spell you want. That's turn 3.
What about, there's other lines too, like Regal Bunnicorn into Invasion of Segovia.
Yeah, that does it by itself.
And then then the bunny corn can just defeat and flip it, and then you go hog on that, right?
Yeah. Yep. And then you kind of back that up with removal. You have Get Lost, Wandering Emperor. And then, it's just, this was one of the first decks that I played when I started testing Standard, because I just have this infatuation with an Invasion of Segovia. I've tried to build a lot of different decks that in Pioneer and stuff. And unfortunately, it's not quite there in Pioneer, but in Standard, we do get to play it. And I think it is quite good. My kind of main issue with this deck is it's a little more vulnerable to cut down, where you have like Regal Bunnicorn. Like if you don't have a Siren or a Warden, even if you just go like Warden into Bunnicorn, it's only a 2/2. So you have to be a little bit careful with your Bunnicorns, because you really don't want to get that thing cut down. So that's something to keep in mind. But I mean, as far as the deck is concerned, it is... Yeah, I mean, Warden's another card that's not great against cut down, where you just like play it on turn 1 and they kill it. So, I mean, the cut down being in all the mid-range decks would make me maybe shy away from this. The one thing that I just, as kind of like this quick aside, and we kind of talked about this earlier when we had this schooner rant. People just need to be playing less Go for the Throats and more Bitter Triumphs, right? It's like, you pay 3 life, that's fine in the grand scheme of things. Maybe you play against mono red and that's unfortunate, but I mean, it's people just, you got to play more Bitter Triumphs to be able to kill these schooners, because the Esper decks are starting to play more, the Dimir decks are playing more, you have this deck that's playing it, Azorius Soldiers is sometimes playing it, so play less Go for the Throats.
Okay, will do. This deck looks really snowball-y. Like, it looks really fun when you're winning, and it looks horrible when you're losing. Like, it looks like it's pretty fragile, and that's probably, like, I would guess its biggest weakness is, like, when you win, you're going to win, and you're going to have fun doing it. But maybe it's not the right metagame. Like, I don't know. Like, when do you think this is good? Like, is this appreciably better than any of the other aggressive decks against like ramp or something like that, or maybe like a mid-range metagame? But I feel like you don't want to see removal in something like this that much. I don't know.
Yeah, it's in a weird position where I think it's not that great against the mid-range decks that have cut down, because again, we talked about cut down is very good against your 1-drops and even good against Bunnicorn sometimes. And I don't think you're quite aggressive enough to be a heavy favorite against Domain, so it's kind of in this weird middle ground. But you ask, why would you play it? Just because you like Invasion of Segovia, and I like that card. So
it's very important to play cards that you like. Did you know that? Play decks.
I did know that.
Play cards that you enjoy casting, and you'll enjoy Magic more. I mean, I think this is cool. Like, I want to test this online for sure, just to like have some kicks with it. But I definitely feel like there's going to be, much like, let's say, prowess in Modern or something like that. Like, the games when I'm losing, I'm just going to be like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I trying this? Yeah,
it's a very, very high roll deck where, like you said, the highs are extremely high, but the lows are like, you open a hand that's like Regal, Bunnicorn, Invasion of Segovia, which, I mean, I guess that's fine by itself. But if they kill your Bunnicorn, and then you like have these 2 tokens, they have to wait 2 turns to flip your invasion, and it's like the deck does have some very, very anemic draws.
Yeah, so not quite the consistency we might want for an RCQ deck, but if you're having some fun on Magic Online or Arena, go for it. Okay, back to these other mid-range decks. I mean, I don't know a lot about them. I do know, I believe, a good handful of people at the NRG brought Dimir mid as their standard choice. I don't know.
That's what Dykeman won with.
Yeah. Dykeman won with it. I remember that. So what do you think went into his thought process, or anyone's thought process, for playing something like, Dimir?
So it's weird, because a lot of the cards that are in the Dimir deck are basically the same thing as Esper, where you have the cut downs, the removal spells, the shield rids, Gixes, schooners, all that stuff, right? The reason that you would choose to play Dimir over Esper is mana considerations, right? One's a 3-color deck, this Dimir's 2-color deck. You're removing a little bit of that variance by cutting the 3rd color, but you are losing a little bit of percentage points in the mid-range matchups because you don't have Rafines or Wedding Announcements to kind of keep up with their opposing, card advantage engine. You don't have quite as a powerful 3-drop like they do. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where you would want to be. I think Dimir is probably also slightly better against red. Again, mana considerations. You have less tap lands, less pain lands, stuff like that. And then I think the last point of contention here is, as again, we've kind of reiterated this the entire show, going under Domain, right? Because you have a better mana base, you're playing 1 less color, you can afford to play more 1-drops. just go, you go Spyglass Siren, Deep Cavern, no, not Deep Cavern, Spyglass Siren, Fairy, Dream Thief. I've even seen Stalactite Stalker in these blue-black decks. So just a pile of 1-drops, more 2-drops, stopping the curve at like Gix, maybe a couple Shield Rids, and that is, I think, a better recipe versus Domain. And you still have the counter spells, right? You're still playing blue-black. So I think it's much, much better against Domain than Esper is.
Okay, I mean, that's really important. Is it better against the Domain deck than Golgari?
Yeah, because of the counter spells, right?
Yeah,
any of the blue mid-range decks, basically. If you kind of rank all of the mid-range decks compared against Domain, it's like the blue mid-range decks tier 1, Rakdos like tier 2.5, and then you have Golgari like underneath the tier list. So yeah, that's pretty much where it is.
Yeah, it's like completely off graphic. You have to like scroll down in your YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay. What about Rakdos mid? We kind of talked about this a little bit, right? Like, is this kind of just the not having Discover, or what's going on here?
So when I looked at, I pulled up Frank's kind of classification, because you can actually, if you go to Frank's table, you can click on the archetype name and it'll bring up a sample deck list.
Yes,
so
perfect.
The only difference between this Rak mid deck and the Rakdos Discover deck is, we talked about earlier, it's increasing the curve a little bit. It's playing Trumpeting Carnosaur. Basically, everything else is the exact same. It's just the curve is slightly higher. Not as high as the ramp decks. But yeah, pretty much everything is the same. And again, we want to talk about this again. Increasing your curve is not where you want to be if you're playing against Domain, but Carnosaur is a little bit better against the other mid-range decks. One other thing worth noting is, I believe, and I might be mistaken, but I think this version plays more Cavern of Souls than the other Rakdos version, and that also Cavern of Souls, Trumpeting Carnosaur is really good against Esper.
Okay. I'm appreciating in this conversation that we're having, after writing all the notes and stuff like that, is like, I'm really hoping that people who are still listening to this episode are
two of them.
Yeah, are appreciating kind of what we're getting into here. I guess we as generous, what you're getting into here is the thought process that you can have in terms of something that's effectively the same deck, but making these changes that are actually really significant, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm going to play this whole new creature that's going to really change the way my deck can approach the format. And that's the kind of stuff in Standard actually happens often, right? And I think that's really cool, because, not to, revisit the point entirely, but we don't or can't really do stuff like that in Modern, I think, because it's just like the options aren't there to do it, right? Or just are frequently not there in the same way. Like, we might have, 3 to 4 flex slots in something like Rhinos, but we're not going to add a whole new creature to the deck because it's just like the options aren't there. Like, nothing's going to have the power level or allow us to cascade into Rhinos because of like mana value considerations. And so those are the type, or it's just like the power level of the card is based entirely around a matchup. And we see that happen much less frequently in Standard, right? Like, we're not saying like, okay, I'm going to bring in this card because it's good against this one particular, deck. Like, I'm not going to, it would be like playing, what's the Charizard that blows up lands that you can play in Rhino sideboards?
Obsidian Charizard.
Yes, Obsidian Charizard.
Charizard.
So like, we're not going to run Obsidian Charmaw main deck in Rhinos. It's just not going to happen because, when it's not great, it's kind of bad. But because the power level is flatter in Standard, we can run these cards that are potentially not amazing, but you can then tune it for a particular meta you're expecting. And even if they're not amazing, they're serviceable in ways that like Obsidian Charmaw would not be. And I think that is kind of like, that can be more fun, right? Where it's just like, hey, I'm going to tweak and tune and consider and predict and make some more significant changes than just like my 13th through 15th sideboard card, which is, again, I said this earlier, but I'm kind of like appreciating it now in this conversation.
Yeah, one last thing I just wanted to kind of, just because you mentioned it, I wanted to pull up I have the Rakdos decks on my other screen side by side. So they both have Blood Tithe, they both have Deep Cavern, they both have Appraiser, they both have Gix, they both have Preacher, they both have, one has Shieldred, one has Archfiend. So the difference is the other kind of lower to the ground deck has Fairy, Dream Thief, and Inti. The other deck has it has a Bone Horde Dracosaur and then Trumpeting Carnosaur. So it's like you're just swapping a 2-drop for a 6-drop. Now, you might ask why you would do that, but it is to make you a little bit better in the mid-range matchups.
Word. So what's up with Orzhov? This is not something that I've seen very much of, even in my sort of casual observations of Standard.
So it is labeled Orzhov in MTG Goldfish, and I believe it was labeled Orzhov on Frank's as well, but it's kind of fake Orzhov. It's just mono white with a very, very light black splash for a couple of Breach the Multiverses to help go over the top of Domain, and a couple of Virtues to help as, removal. Virtue is so good, by the way, because it's just like split card of removal spell. It's like the perfect card where it's good early because you just want to kill their creature, and then it's your best top deck when you have 7 mana because it's just an enchantment that if you untap, you win the game. So
perfect.
Shout out to Virtue, by the way. Perfect card. But yeah, it's utilizing a lot of cheap removal, which, by the way, I think Laydown Arms might be one of the best removal spells in the format, but it's hindered, obviously, by its restrictiveness. You need a lot of planes, and this deck is essentially mono white. So it's got Laydown Arms and Get Lost for removal. Mid-range threats like Restoration of Iganjo, which can help you hit land drops and eventually flip into a 3/4, Wandering Emperor. And then the top end of the curve for finishers, Sanctuary Warden, Eternal Wanderer, and then Breach the Multiverse that we already talked about. The way that I kind of think about this is I think it's much more of a control deck than a mid-range deck because it's playing all those cheap removal spells. It's not necessarily playing mid-range threats in the true fashion like, the Mosswood Dread Knights and the Gixes. It's not really trying to utilize those to apply pressure. It's really just trying to utilize those to get advantage and go later into the game.
Does this get to run, I feel like Orzhov has frequently had a lot of cool planeswalkers that don't see a lot of play. They just sort of have a lot of interesting reanimation or creature generation / control. Do those get to run cool planeswalkers or maybe just the Wandering Emperor?
The list that I have seen usually only have the Wandering Emperor. If I'm taking a look at the list that Claudio, because Claudio is the real proponent of this.
Okay.
He only has 4 Emperors and 1 Eternal Wanderer in the main deck. And then in the sideboard, he has 1 Kaya Intangible Slayer.
Is that Sorin is still legal, right? The pretty good mid-range Sorin? Is that still
the
a legal
4-drop?
card? Yeah, the 4-drop, yeah.
Yeah, it is, but this deck, because as we talked about, is basically mono white, it's a double black card.
Yeah. It's not gonna work.
The mana base is only, if I'm looking at the mana base, it's 4 Raffine's Tower, 2 Swamps, and then 4 Field of Ruin, Demolition Field, Obscura Storefront, that's the Esper. It basically ETBs, doesn't make mana, you sack it, gain a life, and search for a Plan 0 swamp, and then 9 planes, 2 swamps. So it's a very, very light black splash. You wouldn't have the ability to play a double black card. You can't
double black it, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing, we'll talk about this probably starting next week, but we're starting to get spoilers for the new set, and I think that 4-mana Kaya Walker looked pretty decent. So we'll see.
I didn't end up reading it because it had way too many words on it, so I'm just going to take your word for it. But
I don't think it's it's not blowing the doors off, but I think it's a perfectly good 4-mana Walker if there's a deck to support it. So, and that's the kind of thing too, where that's the kind of thing that can make an impact on a smaller format.
Right.
Devin, you have this one up next, and I think you referenced this earlier, a control Rakdos.
It's more of ramp than control. This is what we call, you can either, there's two ways to describe it. You can call it big Rakdos or huge Rakdos.
Okay.
That's what you describe this
Let's go
deck
big,
as.
huge.
Huge, big Rakdos.
How is Rakdos ramping, my friend?
So it's really, it depends. There's some list, most of the lists that I've seen, so basically all of them have 4 big scores. That's kind of step 1. That's level 1.
Is that treasure?
Yeah, so it's 4 mana, instant, discard a card, draw 2, make 2 treasures.
Okay, I like 2 treasures.
And what's perfect about that is you cast it on 4, and then you have turn 5, you play your 5th land, you have 5 lands, 2 treasures, 5 and 2 is 7. That makes Etali or Breach the Multiverse.
Yes.
So it just curves perfectly into that 7-drop that you're playing. I have seen some of these lists. I've seen upwards of 4 Etali and 4 Breach the Multiverse in the same deck. So they're really going deep. The other ramp spells they play sometimes is the 2-mana rock, which is the Iron Crag, and then also the Celestis, which is a 3-mana rock. So that's usually the ramp spells. You have a lot of sweepers, Burn Down the House, Brotherhood's End main deck. They're definitely being prepared for the more lower to the ground mid-range decks and mono red decks. And then you have, that's pretty much it. Removal, ramp, fatties, or big stuff at the top, excuse me. There's no aggressive creatures. There's no mid-range threats. It's just kill your stuff, ramp. Here's a 7-drop. That's what it's trying to do.
Okay. We've mentioned Etali a few times, and I don't feel like this is enough of a household name that I'm not going to tell people what it is. It's a 5 red 7/7 trampling legendary elder dinosaur. Sick. When it ETBs, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. Okay. You may cast any number of spells from among the non-land cards exiled their way without paying their mana cost. That seems okay.
So you get a 7/7 and 2 spells.
You can also transform it for 9 and a Phyrexian green.
I did that once.
It becomes an 11/11 indestructible trample that also deals poison counters as damage.
It basically has player death touch.
Yeah, it's perfect. I love it. So yeah, that's a good 7-drop.
I did play against this deck one time where they cast Itali on 7. Itali flipped their Trumpeting Carnosaur and my Shieldred, right? So they have both of those. Their Trumpeting Carnosaur hit Cruelty of Gix, which reanimated another Itali. The second Itali hit another Trumpeting Carnosaur, and that Carnosaur hit something else. So they just they cast one Itali and they had 7 creatures in play. It was completely insane.
Speaking of something mildly wild, we've got Azorius Craft up next. This is actually, I think, the Azorius deck that I thought was sort of controlling, but now I realize that they were doing sort of craft shenanigans. This is at 2.6% of the meta, more or less, overall, and I don't really know what my opponent was trying to do besides some stuff that seemed pretty cool. What have you experienced with this deck?
I played a couple matches with it, and it's kind of a funky one. It's a strange one. So from the best that I can understand it, it's trying to utilize Fabrication Foundry and Thran Spider as this ramp engine. So Foundry is it's a 2-mana rock. It taps for white mana, but you can only use that mana for artifacts.
Okay.
And then Thran Spider is a colorless 3-mana 2/4. When it enters the battlefield, you and your opponent get a map token, or not a map token.
Power Stone.
Yeah. Power Stone, yes. So both of those get you to 5 mana on turn 4, right? And then you have 8. The deck that I played had 8 5-drops. So it was 4 Mightstone and Weakstone and 4 Unstable Glyph Bridge.
Okay.
A lot of people might not know what Glyph Bridge is. It's 3 white. It's an artifact. 3 white. When it enters the battlefield, each player chooses a creature from among the creatures they control with power 2 or less and destroy everything else. So if let's say they curve I don't know, maybe Mosswood Dread Knight into Gix into Shieldred, and you have a Thran Spider, you get to keep your spider, they lose everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a pretty powerful wrath, and all of these cards, like Fabrication Foundry, Glyph Bridge, they all have, not Foundry, but it has other ability. They all have secondary effects. So Foundry can get stuff back from the graveyard. Glyph Bridge crafts into this angel that starts attacking your opponent. Your removal spell, which is Spring-Loaded Saw Blades, even also has a craft ability. So that one is 2 mana, deal 5 to a tap creature, and then you can just flip it into a 5/5. So all of these cards, they kind of play dual roles where they're killing their stuff early, and then later in the game you're just kind of using that stuff to kind of flip into it.
Mm-hmm. It's got everything sort of transformed in the end. Everything sort of just had early utility and late utility if they could sort of buy themselves the time and make things happen. Braided net. Braided net was cool, right? Even it was just annoying. They were tapping my stuff down, and then eventually it flips and they get a bunch of card advantage, and you're well, the game's over.
Yeah, no, I got to flip Braided Net and draw 9 cards, and that was a pretty good feeling.
Seems okay.
And then on top of all that, you get to meld because you have the Mightstone and Weakstone, and you play the 3-mana Urza, Lord Protector, I think is what it's called, where if you can, I think Urza says you can pay 7 mana if you have both that and the Mightstone and Weakstone, and it melds into this Planeswalker that has 5 abilities, and you can use abilities twice each turn. It wins the game on the spot, basically.
That seems sweet.
And I got to do that. I got to meld once, and it was really fantastic.
And yeah, your melding experiences you don't forget, because they're novel ones for sure.
Oh yeah. But that was cool. I don't know. I feel like it's a little clunky for what it's trying to do. And the biggest issue is it doesn't get to play cheap removal, right? You have Saw Blades and Casket, but you don't have any 1-mana removal. So you're kind of in this weird spot where it kind of feels like you're stuck playing 1 spell per turn up until turn 4 or turn 5. And especially with all the mid-range decks providing, having these cards that put so much pressure on you early and also get cards back, it seems really tough to keep up with that.
Yeah, makes total sense. Up next, I think, is a potential sleever that I think is kind of growing in popularity quickly, and that's Bant Toxic, which Frank has at 2% of the meta, but 4% of the winner's meta. So this is pretty quietly just behind a lot of the decks we've been talking about at 4% of the winner's meta. And like Modern Infect, this is designed to get the opponent to 10 poison counters as quickly as possible. And Shane, you don't think Toxic seems that good, right? That's what you're telling me. Toxic is questionable. But the way this does this is with like the cheap toxic creatures, cheap bounce spells, and then proliferate spells. So this is how it can do the infect thing, which is like, hey, we don't get to play the damage boosting spells, but we do get to play proliferate spells that get to add those infect counters. You don't even have to get the more damage in. You just have to be able to cast these spells. There's even a cool combo with Venerated Rot Priest and March of Swirling Mist, and that is a spell that reads X and a blue, up to X target creatures phase out. Target creatures. So as an additional cost to cast a spell, you may exile any number of blue cards from your hand, and that makes the spell cost 2 generic less for each of those. So if you remember, Rot Priest looks for creatures you control becoming a target of a spell. So if you have a number of creatures and you target them with March of Swirling Mist, you can get to lethal out of nowhere. And so this is kind of another deck looking to close the door quickly, not really necessarily happening what's on the other side of the board as much as like a red, let's say aggressive deck, right? Where it's like, hey, I've got to get some more damage in, but you've got a few blockers, so I can't really do that. Like this can just get damage in with proliferate spells that are doing other things from your hand. This looks like a solid counter to Domain to me, because that doesn't really have enough cheap removal or counter magic to like stop what this deck's trying to do. Like, what are your thoughts on messing with this deck?
So I'm gonna be honest with you, Shane. I think this deck is kind of just broken.
Okay.
I've seen a lot of different posts on Twitter at like over the past weekend or so of just people just like I scroll through my Twitter, I see one post, just won by RCQ with Bant Toxic. Go to the next post, maybe like 2 or 3 more posts down, just won by RCQ with Bant Toxic. 3 posts later, won by RCQ with Bant Toxic. It seems like everybody is winning an RCQ with this deck, and it's so weird because I've played against this deck a couple of times. I will say personally, I haven't played it myself, so it's more all of what my like kind of reservations are just from playing against it and not the experience of it myself. But it kind of like, when you look at the deck on paper, it looks horrendous. It's just like a bunch of draft cards, right? And it just they kind of play out in this weird way where you just get to put like you kind of put your opponent in a spot where they either don't have the ability to cast a removal spell because they just lose to Rot Priest, or their removal spells are good because you have Crawling Chorus that replaces itself, you have Skrelv's Hive, which like, who cares if they're cut downing a Skrelv's Hive token, you're just going to get another one next turn. So it's like weirdly resilient and hyper aggressive, and it has the perfect mix of that while having counter spells. So like, it just feels like the deck is kind of busted.
Man, I forgot that Crawling Chorus is so messed up art. Like if you've got like that, if you're one of those people who can't look at like lotus flower pods, like don't look at Crawling Chorus. Let me tell you that.
Yeah, no,
I don't care for
Stay
that.
away from that one. But yeah, good deck.
Do you think? Yeah, like what's the counter against this? Like, do you think like, you know, is mid-range going to have to lower its curve to like stop the early toxic creatures and then never really get a chance to like let them get the proliferate engine going, or what? Like, what are we talking about here?
It's kind of a tough question to answer. I've played against it a couple of times, at least from the Golgari side of things, and I might have played against it once or twice with Rakdos. And yeah, it feels like the draws where you have, like, if you're matching their curve out, your cards are just better than the Bant decks. So, like, if you curve out, say, like, cut down their 1-drop, maybe they play a Skrelv or a Rot Priest, and you can actually trade 1-for-1 instead of Crawling Chorus, and then you, like, just play it's all about playing blockers, right? Because you get into these spots where they get to profitably attack with 4 tokens if you have one, like let's say you have a 2/2 and they have 3 1/1s, right? They're just like, okay, I'm going to send in my 3 1/1s. You're going to block with your 2/2. That's fine. I'm going to get another token next turn. But when you can have more good blockers, right? So that's why we talked about Golgari having the curve of like Dread Knight into Sentinel into Shieldred. You have 3 creatures, all of which check the 1/1 tokens, and one of them even has Vigilance. So you're even attacking them while blocking. So it's really just like stabilizing a little bit early, setting up a board where they don't have profitable attacks, and then probably just draining them out with Shieldred.
Makes sense. I like it.
Blockers. Blocking is good.
Devon, you snuck in a deck on me. And
I did.
You can't post stuff like this to me because this takes me back to the one and only deck I ever brewed. Okay? I brewed one deck, and it was Azorius Prowess back in like the Fate Reforged type days. Maybe Dragons of Tarkir. Because I don't know if you remember, there was like that 4 mana prowess creature that like could
Ojitize Exemplars.
Oh, my man, you were there with me.
I know that set like the back of my hand.
Yeah, so like I made a deck that was, really kind of around like Monastery Mentor, Ojitize Exemplars. I had the 5 mana Ojitai Dragon at the top of the curve. And what was cool about that is like I sort of was just like, I need something to top my curve, and this seems really good. And then like the week after that is when it broke out in standard on like the SCG weekend and like immediately shot up to like quite a bit of money. So I felt like a genius at that point. But so this looks kind of like, this looks like a prowess style deck, and it plays Monastery Mentor, which is always a card that I've wanted to see do something.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of do a very, very quick, brief shout out to this deck because I built it in paper, mostly because it's dirt cheap. It's like I had basically everything I needed for it. So, but what this deck is trying to do is the deck is called Azorius Mentor. So what it has is a lot of the cheap cantrips. You have Sleight of Hand, Consider to help kind of like smooth out your draws. You even play Otherworldly Gaze, which is the 1 mana Surveil 3, and then it can flash back. Because what you want to do is you want to mill either Haughty Djinn or Monastery Mentor, and then once you mill one of those 3 drops, you can get them back with either Helping Hand, which costs 1 mana, or Recommission, which is 2 mana.
That seems worse. 2 mana.
Yeah, two is more than 1, so not great here. But what's nice about Recommission is if you have Djinn already in play, then you get a discount on Recommission, because Djinn makes all your spells cost 1 less.
Sick.
So it's kind of like get Djinn or Mentor into play a bunch of cantrips, make a bunch of Monk tokens, or just have like a 10 power Djinn. Yeah, I've been liking this deck a lot. I don't think it's that good, but it's really, really fun to play.
Yeah, I was going to say, this looks like a deck that is a little bit too mopey in a metagame that's dominated by Domain and other mid-range decks, but it looks like it would be a lot of fun as you lose, as you go like 1-3 or something like that at your FNM.
Yeah, if I don't get my Golgari cards in time, I'm going to have to play this deck, and maybe I'll lose, but I'll at least have fun doing it.
Oh man. Okay. We talked about a lot of decks. I hope this gives you all a feel for what's going on in the metagame. So yeah, there's a lot of different styles of mid-range, but that's basically saying there's a lot of different styles of Magic, because mid-range is a spectrum, right? And so we've got everything from the hyper-aggressive red decks, which can also be built a little bit bigger, to the Azorius Soldiers decks, which can go from aggro to light mid-range. We've got the different flavors of regular mid-range, which can have low to high curves. We've got things all the way up to the Domain ramp decks and gigantic Rakdos, right? So there's a huge spectrum of decks and what they're bringing to the table and different ways that they have strengths and weaknesses against all the other decks in the format. So I'm into this. Like, this takes me back. And there's even reanimation strategies, right? Like, there's a Rakdos sort of reanimation thing going on. Makes me think of like the whip decks from cons, like Whip of Erebos, getting cool stuff back out of the graveyard. Like, there's just a lot of interesting options here, and I'm very into it.
We didn't touch on it, but there is a combo deck. It's incredibly convoluted, and that's probably why we would need like a podcast and a half to talk about the deck, but it's Cauldron. There's like an infinite mana combo with Kami and Sleep Curse Fairy, but there's a combo deck as well.
I kind of felt like sort of Bant Toxic is like combo-esque, and maybe that Azorius deck is sort of vaguely combo-esque. Like, it's not the same kind of combo. All right, Devon. So I know that you play a lot of RCQs. You're more of the grinder and the weekend warrior than typically the other host besides maybe Stan. How are you approaching this metagame? How are you approaching your RCQs? Like, what are you thinking about?
Well, at least for me, I only have, right now I have the Golgari deck. Well, Golgari deck currently tentatively built with waiting cards in the mail and that Blue Wave Mentor deck. So I'm not going to really like maybe flip-flop between a bunch of different decks. But I mean, if you're looking to, like, if you have a lot of different decks built and you're kind of not sure what you want to play in your next RCQ, what I would highly recommend is kind of keeping an eye on what's doing well in the Moto challenges, because there are still a lot of people, within the competitive scene, and maybe not in your local area, but people will still pay attention to Moto results, right? So, for example, if you see a top 8 of a Moto event with 4 Infect decks, might not be a great weekend to bring a deck that's bad against Infect like Domain. So, you got to keep that in mind and maybe like try to be a step ahead of that metagame.
That makes me think, though, right? Like, okay, we know that paper players are typically more into Modern, maybe Pioneer. So like when you go to your Modern RCQ, depending on where you live, you might expect 50 to 70 people. Right? Like Standard has been a little bit by the wayside in terms of paper engagement. So like when you go to a Standard RCQ, are you expecting to see like some, stone cold like killers out there? Or do you think it's going to be people who like picked up their Standard deck for the first time ever? And, not ever played it, but maybe like ever in paper. And, they're marching it out there and hoping to sort of use their generally good skill. Like, do you think like this is an environment that people can maybe try to capitalize on?
I mean, I would kind of assume that the people who are going to RCQs are the people who are going to RCQs. And, whatever people that went in the previous seasons that were Modern or Pioneer, if they're willing to go to RCQs and, travel hour or 2 hours, they're probably going to do that for Standard too. So I don't think too much would change about that. But yeah, maybe like some additional people who are more like, I guess the attendance difference would be the people who are mainly arena focused and they only play arena formats like Standard. Yeah. Maybe those people are like, hey, I want to get into competitive paper. I'm going to buy a Standard deck. And you might see people like that.
Yeah. I'm just more thinking like, is this an environment in which people who listen to this podcast can try to find a certain niche where it's like, hey, there's not going to be there's not going to be Shane showing up for like his 2 RCQs during the Modern RCQ season, right? And Modern's a type of environment where I think you can maybe get by on some memory, you can get by on some sort of natural instinct because the decks are so good. And, I have a pretty good record at the last RCQs I've went to, but that's also because Rhinos is pretty good and it's not that hard to play. I feel like the Standard is an environment where you have to leverage your knowledge of the format and your knowledge of matchups a little bit more. So like, is it the type of thing where you think you might have to prepare even more, or like you would suggest people to prepare in a certain way, or like think about it in a certain way? Like you said, like looking at Magic Online or something like that.
Yeah, I think definitely checking the Magic Online results is probably, I mean, realistically, it's kind of the only results that we have access to, right? Like there's no other big tournaments that are happening. I mean, sometimes you get reports of top 8 of RCQs from Fire Shoes, shout out to Fire Shoes, but we don't get a ton of information outside of the challenges. So yeah, I mean, and like you mentioned, you can't, like, if you purchase, and I don't want to scare people off, but if you purchase a deck for Standard right now, like maybe you purchased the Bant Toxic deck, it's not clear that deck is going to be good in 3 or 4 weeks from now. Maybe the metagame changes to where people are just a lot more hostile. People have finally figured out how to beat it. And that can happen in Modern, but it happens, it's much more, it's much more pronounced in Standard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with that, right? Or else I think there's big opportunity on both sides, right? Like I think you could take advantage of a big opportunity if you kind of call things correctly or you approach things correctly. But then if your opponent does and you don't, then you are on the other side of that coin, I guess. So, I mean, how when let's say Devon O'Donnell has his Golgari Midrange core built out, and you've got an RCQ happening on Saturday. What are you particularly looking at on like Thursday to make your final decisions? Is it like what's doing well, or are you saying, meaning not what's doing well for Golgari, but what's doing well on the ladder, or excuse me, not on the ladder. What's doing? I guess you could look at the results.
You could look at the ladder too.
Untapped stuff, but you can basically say like, okay, what's winning? How would you go about changing your deck or thinking about, your approach that would be different than in Pioneer or Modern?
Tough question. I mean, like, for I guess using an example like Domain, right? If I saw that maybe this past weekend's challenges were a little bit maybe more dominated by Domain, and I expect more people to show up with Domain, then I'm going to like really reassess and see if there's anything I can do to maybe solve that matchup. And sometimes the answer is you can't solve it, and sometimes you just have to punt a matchup. But yeah, I mean, it's really just looking at the data that we have available, trying to utilize that, predict a metagame, which it's still really difficult in paper. We can talk about looking at results and all that stuff, but there are some people who are just going to play the deck that they either have or want to play.
Yeah, like
so
who's buying?
Going to do.
No one's going to. I mean, very few people I think are buying like 6 different standard decks like they might have for Modern. Right. Because they just the longevity, even with 3 years potentially, is not necessarily going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry, are you excited for the standard ICQ season? Do you think it's like a breath of fresh air, or are you kind of resigned to playing it?
No, I love this format. I've been playing standard more in this past month than I basically have in the last 2 years, and it's awesome. I think this format's fantastic. The games are always fun. There's not like anything that's super overpowered and oppressive. A lot of decision points, a lot of, like we said, metagaming and making sure you can pick the right deck or have the right sideboard plan. Just, it seems like there's a lot. It's very dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm extremely close to putting some cash into Arena, rebuilding my standard collection a little bit there, because I think it's a fun way to play. I mean, as much as I like Magic Online, I can't play it on my phone. So, but don't worry, y'all. After all this, I'm sure we haven't converted you all to be standard mains. I don't think we would consider ourselves that either by any way, shape, or form. I see a Mosswood Dread Knight and a Liliana of the Veil. Hey, you know what my problem is, Devin, is I sold my Lilianas.
They're like $7. They're not that expensive.
It's $7 I got to spend on 4 of them. But so don't worry, Modern's coming back. Like, we've got Modern RCs coming soon in January 27th. There's one in Brazil. There's one in Europe. We'll have some tournament breakdowns for you. We got some spoiler episodes coming up soon as well. So, we are not becoming a standard podcast, whether you like it or not, I suppose. So thank you for indulging this episode. Again, Devin, I thought this was going to be like an hour 15. Here we are, like an hour 40, chit-chatting about standard.
I can keep going if you want, but I don't think the listeners would like that.
Probably not. But so that wraps this week's show up. If you haven't yet, subscribe to us. You get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. Automatically downloads it. It seems good. It pads our numbers. If you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review there. Feel free to leave us a comment or a star rating over on Spotify, I believe it's called. If you want to submit a question to the podcast or reach out to us, give us a tweet at The Dive Down. Give us an email, thedivedown@gmail.com. If you want to support us, you want to keep the show going, join the Patreon, patreon.com/thedive down. Also check out the store, thedivedown.com/store. Go to heavyplay.com, get some awesome deck and dice boxes, some awesome playmats using the Equip Mag system. Use code TheDiveDown2024. Gets 10% off of your first order. Mana Traders, of course, a long-time affiliate of The Dive Down. Use promo code TheDiveDown_3YO, or look for the code in the show notes for 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and sucking on those chili dogs.